I can see that there were a lot of hearty discussions out there in the assembly. I wonder if there could be one or two persons who would like to give a succinct summary of what you've come with.
Thank you. I think one of the items, I'm Richard Perry on the faculty here at LSTC. One of the items that came up in our discussion, and I did not check with our group to see if that was permissible, but I'm going to take permission, is what about the wisdom that people outside of the congregation, where does that play a role in the shaping and forming of people inside the congregation, and then when folks then go out back into the community and the context in which they are serving?
Thank you so much. So that's a comment about the wisdom that's outside the doors of our assemblies. We now turn to the second speaker, Bishop Burke.
Thank you. There are days when I'm tempted to conclude that all of ministerial wisdom boils down to the sign on the first grade classroom wall from when I was a kid. Keep your hands to yourself. But most days, and increasingly, I'm persuaded that ministerial wisdom is built upon a deep and broad understanding of the real presence. I mean, we Lutherans are pretty good at wrapping our minds around, or maybe more precisely, our faith around the premise, the promise, that in bread and wine shared in the assembly, Christ is with us. In the scriptures opened and the good news proclaimed, Christ is with us, really, present. It's a little trickier as to what we're willing and able to wrap our minds and our faith around after that, or because of that. So let me say a bit about the landscape and how I think we're caught up right now in a particularly reactive period of life together. Institutionally speaking, the church has a difficult time of being strategic when faced with a crisis. In other words, we are less likely to discern where the church ought to be and then move deliberately and methodically to that place than we are to hunker down and to make the most of the present realities. There are reasons for that, and of course there are exceptions, but for the most part, we human beings are instinctively self-protective, including and maybe especially when the self is a collective. It is true about congregations, it's true about synods, it's also true about a church-wide organization, that when the threat is real, to the extent possible, we tend to protect what we love, or at least what's most familiar to us, even when we talk boldly, faithfully about the future, convinced that God is calling us to a different place, to be a different kind of church. Listen carefully to what we say, because all too often you will hear talk of the need to grow or to expand capacity. In other words, to get stronger, to be stronger for the sake of mission, so that we can be about the church's mission, Christ's own mission, which sounds right because of that mission part. But too often it becomes an argument to protect and preserve what we've got, or what we're used to doing, or what we're convinced has served us well in spite of a long-standing and continuing movement in the wrong direction. And I boldly confess, that I've been guilty of the same preservational approach. It takes a different kind of commitment, an uncommon vision to move and act like you trust that expanding capacity is the outcome of missional work rather than the prerequisite. And even if you could strategically envision the church we should be, or that we really wish we could be, and that we know we need to be right now, especially in light of the Pew Study and of our own assessment of prevailing trends, even if we could see that potential church clearly enough to describe it, if we could make the case so persuasively that we might enact it, the trouble is that while we work to become something different right now, what we have been does not simply go away. Always being made new is the way the ELCA 25th anniversary theme says it. In institutional terms, not suddenly new, not now unmistakably different, but always being made, in transition, moving, betwixt and between, especially now, because what that newness, that future church looks like is not as evident, as discernible as we like to think. So in an era of reactive uncertainty, what does ministerial wisdom require of us? Well, first, more than ever, I think, it requires remembering and reminding others that it is always about Jesus. And I don't mean that in some narrow second article kind of way, but in the fullest Trinitarian sense that the God who loves this broken down world of ours and blows like the wind among us is revealed most fully in this Jesus who calls the likes of us to follow, to come and see, to be a difference-making presence. And I could go on to provide a laundry list of my desired marks of ministerial wisdom, which is likely to resemble a delineation of the things needed to stay out of trouble. And it's likely to be informed by things I've been dealing with lately. For instance, I'd talk about how it is critical to see the value in still emerging methods of communication, including social media. And then I'd warn of how much more quickly and devastatingly a slip-up on Twitter or Facebook can get you into trouble and can have a negative impact on how people interpret the good news we seek to proclaim. And I'd argue that no matter how convenient an email can be, there's nothing like having your own voice heard or looking into the eyes of the other, even on Skype, when it comes to communicating anything of real consequence. And I would encourage anyone who's serious about ministry to carry a copy of Luther's explanation of the Eighth Commandment in your pocket at all times, or better, in your heart as a guide and a guard against so many things. After all, ministry is grounded in relationships, and it thrives when those relationships are healthy. But let me talk about how we talk about life together in the synod where I serve. We use some very familiar words like gathered, claimed, and sent. And by gathered, we mean the regular gathering of God's people in worship and how that is central to everything we do. The means of grace, word and sacrament, informs, shapes all of ministry. And we're claimed in baptism, washed, connected in Jesus Christ. And by virtue of that baptism, we are connected to one another. And that's a big deal. It's a big deal considering how much we need each other these days. An even bigger deal knowing that in our need, we have each other and we're sent. We're sent to serve the neighbor, to move together in the same direction, always in the direction of need, and along the way to invite others into a relationship with this Jesus who is the hope of all the world, which is how you get back to the real presence, the same presence around which we gather, the same presence that claims us in baptism. That same presence sends us to be the body of Christ. The very real presence calls us to wrap our minds, our faith, our living around a promise that we carry, or more profoundly, that carries us into every encounter. The promise that Christ is with us, that his determination to teach and heal and feed, that his ministry is our ministry. His life is our life. His story is our story, and the story is still unfolding, not apart from, but integral to how the life of this church is still unfolding. And as realistic as it may seem to think that our future is dependent somehow on the numbers, on the self-assessments, on the studies or the structures that we use to measure our strength or our capacity, or that it depends on clearly seeing what we can't always see or that we can't yet clearly see, as realistic as that seems, I am more heartened by the examples of people I know who more consistently, most consistently, thrive in ministry. Whether they have a whole bag full of gifts or just one or two gems that cause them to be an otherwise average human being with a little lopsidedness. Those who thrive have this much in common. They know this is not a competition, and they never act like it is. They've honed the skill of deep listening, or at least somehow they've convinced others that those others are being heard, especially the others with whom they are most likely and most often disagree. See, that's the thing. They practice a strange kind of radical hospitality. And by that I mean they've figured out how to talk to, how to welcome people across almost any spectrum, reaching never in just one direction, because ministry is never first any agenda that any one of us brings. And the wise ones know that. They know that this is always about Jesus. They understand that there needs to be a discernible correspondence between what they say about Jesus and how they act, which means they believe wholeheartedly in the forgiveness of sins, and they are not averse to saying, I'm sorry, I screwed up, will you forgive me? And their baptismal theology allows them, even compels them, to ask others for help. And as much as they would like to be able to strategically move toward a specific goal, and oftentimes with the help of others, even able to name that goal and move toward it, they know this story, and that this story is still unfolding, and they understand that at least as important as moving toward is moving with one another, trusting that Christ is with us, really present, drawing us together, moving us in the same direction. Ministerial wisdom understands that the movement of the presence, the movement with the real presence, strategic or not, the movement is always in the direction of the world's deepest need. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bishop. And now we return to Yahel Curie for your words now.
Thank you. President Neiman, thank you for the opportunity. Ministerial wisdom. If I'm to be honest with myself, this topic is impossible without me focusing in on my story. So I'm going to take Reverend Linda's advice and give you my narrative. In 1995, when I graduated from Lewis University with a BA degree in psychology, I was convinced that I would never again waste anyone's time trying to get an academic degree. Yet here I sit 17 years later as an ordained pastor, developer of Shekinah Chapel Lutheran Church, yet with still 3 classes left for an MDiv degree. How did I get here? My parents were married at age 15. 10 blocks from here. My mother had her first baby at age 16. She had a baby every year for the next 10 years after that. 7 girls, 4 boys. Then her husband was murdered on 65th and Stony Island, 10 blocks from where we sit right now. I've witnessed the paradox of 2 communities, Hyde Park and those of us who dare to live 10 blocks south, 10 blocks north, or 10 blocks west. One community, a childhood of poverty. For my family, that meant walking past your father's final resting place every day for 15 years. Another community full of new constructions, new buildings. One community, unanswered 911 calls. Another community, an ever-growing police force to protect so few. Failing public schools 10 blocks from here, the investment of new schools and lab schools on this side of the city. Although families like mine had fewer resources, we still persevered. My senior year in high school, my mother was working on a master's degree at Northern Illinois University. And she challenged each and every one of us to go to college, or at least give it a try. So like the 6 siblings before me, I did. In 1996, returning from college, getting married, buying a home in the South Shore area, I was invited to a worship service that was somehow connected to the mentoring of young black boys. Now, I was a little hesitant because church just wasn't my thing. But the mentoring aspect appealed to me. As I walked into the sanctuary of St. Stephen's Lutheran Church on the south side of Chicago, I saw a big banner that read, "The Simba Circle. Rescue their gifts, release their potentials, and restore their dignity." You see, 3 years prior to my arrival, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America initiated a 2-week camping experience called the Simba Circle. This camp was a response to youth violence and the need for mentorship among African American males in Chicago and other urban areas around the United States. After Simba's second year in operation, it was determined that these young men that attended the camp were not being reached by mainline congregations, and apart from Simba, had limited ability to continue the process of restoring themselves spiritually. So a worship service called Shekinah Chapel was started to increase contact with these young males so that mentoring would continue after camp. This high-energy contemporary service was Simba's attempt to bring the church to the youth instead of asking the youth to come to the church. Although I was now an adult, it felt like an institution was finally speaking to the hurt I experienced as a child in a language that I could understand. So in the process of trying to help some young men, I was being healed by the Lutheran Church. St. Stephen's allowed Simba and Shekinah Chapel to occupy their space for 10 years. Shekinah Chapel members decided after 10 years of just being an interest group, or what we call synodically authorized worshiping communities in the Lutheran Church, we decided that it was time to move towards church development. So in 2005, after our spiritual leader left, and there was a recommendation by our congregation, I began to discern a call to ministry with the encouragement of our Senate office. This discernment process led me to being named lay mission developer of Shekinah Chapel. It turns out that once we made the decision to grow and expand, we did. This group of 60 to 70 new converts to the Lutheran Church, African Americans, average age 25, doubled in size and resulted in Shekinah Chapel being presented with an opportunity to occupy our Savior's Lutheran Church in Riverdale, Illinois, about 30 minutes south of here. Our Savior's Lutheran Church, a once thriving mission center, had been reduced to a group of 7 aging members who either had no ability or no desire to minister to the new residents of this community. Riverdale, a population of 15,000, who had been abandoned by the steel mill, which was responsible for its financial boom in its heyday, was now made up of 87% African-American families. 20 years prior, 20% African-American. No public transportation. When the steel mill left, so did Chicago Transit Authority. 47% of the population under the age of 18. Medium income, 38,000. 40% of its residents face hunger every day. 3 sides of the community landlocked due to rail yards. We said, oh yes, this is where we're supposed to be. We want to occupy this church. Some of us, though, was torn. Do we continue doing the ministry in Chicago, or do we become a part of resurrecting a church in Riverdale? Resurrect the church in Riverdale. I was accepted into the Theological Education for Emerging Ministries, often known as TEAM, in 2007. TEAM is a process by which the ELCA approves for roster of ordained ministers those who by reason of age and prior experience are qualified to participate in an alternate program of preparation for ordination. This alternate ordination program meant that I would need to complete 6 core classes here at LSTC, complete CPE, an internship, while simultaneously executing my duties as lay mission developer of Shekinah Chapel and the new territory of Riverdale. My days consisted of one-on-ones with new neighbors, seminary classes, weekly Bible study, preaching, weddings, and funerals. While difficult, this grueling process gave me a unique perspective. I was able to apply practical ministry tools immediately. I learned that this was an advantage that students who were not engaged in continuous ministry did not have. This got me to thinking, what would happen if the seminary submitted a proposal to the church-wide organization to occupy a church that was closing or was in danger of being closed? It might mean a different type of urban experience for students. Can you imagine professors preaching at the local church where those who make up the pews, they don't grade in class? Oh, how would the message change? Local residents being offered an opportunity to audit a class by way of being introduced to the Lutheran Church. a J-term class on community organizing, where because LSTC was invested in the church, the doors you knocked on would be your brothers and sisters. Surveys given to the residents. Prayer for strangers in earnest. A church and society class where we would present observations about what we're seeing happening in the classroom around us. A class on education that might meet on Sundays. I'm talking about a class that was responsible for the construction of the Sunday school curriculum or confirmation class. An independent study that looked at how violence relates to theology or how failing schools might negatively impact Sunday school. Another thing that I want to offer to this discussion is it would be wrong for me to be sitting here without even attempt to discuss the issue that we're having as African American clergy and the ELCA. Right now, we're at about 225 clergy members, making up a little bit under 300 congregations that are considered predominantly African American. The average age being 55. In 10 years, 70% of African American clergy will be retirement age, yet we're not producing enough in our seminaries to replace them. I have a recommendation, and that is we go where they are, the church. What it would be like for the seminary to occupy the church. I don't know about you, but I'd be pretty excited if on the marquee of the Shekinah Chapel sign was a sign that says satellite site for Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. What might that mean for our church and our seminary? In closing, there are more like me in the community waiting for us to occupy the church. We have to be willing to neglect some of our work we've been doing to be a part of resurrection. Thank you.